Birmingham, a city of crime with its own history within the underworld. Come take a dive with me into the history and culture of gangs within Birmingham. Here we have the Peaky Blinders. The Peaky Blinders were a gang of youth-centered criminals that had existed between the years of 1890 and then the early 1910s. The most notable feature was the outfits in which most of the gang members had worn, tailored clothing that had usually consisted of an overcoat and yellow-bottomed trousers. They were founded in Small Heath by a man named Thomas Mucklow, as stated by the newspaper article entitled "A Murderous Outrage. At Small Heath, a man's skull fractured," the earliest mention of the Peaky Blinders in recorded history.
In another case, which occurred last Saturday week, a young man named Eastwood was murderously assaulted by a number of members of a gang known as the Small Heath Peaky Blinders.
The first notable activities the group had committed was acquiring land. As they were the biggest group in Small Heath, they had acquired the land quite easily and had absorbed the small street sloggers, meaning either a street gang or a group of youths who were committing crimes. Within a few months, they had started to expand into other gang territory, and thus they initiated a gang war between the Cheapside Sloggers, the only notable gang within Cheapside, being a much older gang, being even recorded since the 1870s they had experience. But due to the extremely poor area, weapons were numbered and few and eventually lost due to the more members of the Peaky Blinders side and the weapons the Peaky Blinders used, thus gaining the territory of Cheapside. In 1897, 7 years after the group's first major appearance, they had frequently taken part in many gang wars that had an activity widely known as constable baiting, which one was an officer of the police and attacks him in a group of people. The most notable death was an officer by the name of George Snipe, who died in the same year, and in 1901 Charles Philip Gunter, who had died of a brutal death of blunt force trauma. It is suspected that hundreds of cops were injured enough to leave the force as a result of the attacks committed by this group, only gaining more powers though they weakened the opposition. Picking up after the reign of the Peaky Blinders, we have the Birmingham Boys. The Birmingham Boys were a street gang whose power extended from the north of England to London's underworld. Between the 1910s and the 1930s, the leader, named William "Billy" Kimber, was regarded for several years as the biggest crime boss within the United Kingdom at the time of the gang's peak. By 1913, Billy Kimber and the Brummagem Boys, otherwise known as the Birmingham Boys, which had been formed during the early 1910s at the decline of the Peaky Blinders, had been introduced into the race course protection rackets possibly by George "Brummy" Sage, whom Billy Kimber had met while serving time in 1901. The closure of racehorses during World War I put a temporary pause on Kimber's activities. He joined up to the military, but he was either discharged or deserted by 1915. When racing resumed after the war, Kimber and the Brummagem Boys recommenced their protection rackets, and Kimber for a while became probably the biggest organised crime boss within the UK. In March 1921, the Brummagems ambushed Sabini at Grenfell Trotting Park. A few days later, Kimber was found shot dead and beaten in King's Cross, London, having gone to visit Sabini. Alfred Solomon was tried for unlawful wounding, but the case was dropped as there was no evidence against him. The violence escalated, but Sabini gained the upper hand on 23 Brummagem Boys, were looked up following the Epsom Road battle. Due to the losses in the Epsom Road battle, he had fled to Phoenix, Arizona for a number of years as he had business with an unknown party that had owed him a substantial amount of money. Billy had returned to England in 1929 and apparently set up as a legitimate booker. Several advertisements in the Western Morning News in 1937 had an advertisement bet with a reliable man, Billy Kimber, thus ending the reign of Billy Kimber and the Brummagem Boys.
I'd like to thank you for watching.